sciences community, one of the bright new talents that this university has been hiring in recent years to help the university maintain and in fact improve its national and international reputation as an institution of higher learning. And for sociology, I've been having this pleasure quite a lot. Within the last few years, I've been able to introduce to the community people like Carrie Brown and Krista Bramley and David Morola that I introduced last week, and Sarah Swinder and Nicole Virgilio Pagan, and before that people like Monica White and your bright young chair, Taylor Dillard. So we have this wonderful department with bright new talent that commingle with the excellent senior faculty that you have in that department. So well done. Well, Zach, only 13 years ago, in 2000, he was completing his BA in sociology, minoring in criminal justice from Grand Valley State University. It's probably a Michigander. I'm native Michigander. And then he went on to show that he is smart all over the place. He went on to Western Kentucky University and got his MA in 2002. And then to show that he's smart in all other places too, he went on to get his PhD in 2009 from North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. His dissertation there was Restaurant Servers and Their Racial Minority Guests, an examination of the extent and nature of race-based discriminatory treatment towards minority restaurant patrons. His MA thesis was Alienation and Exploitation Among Restaurant Servers, Qualitative Analysis. So he's been working in this area for quite a while, doing what I most enjoy, is sort of advocacy scholarship. He started teaching at Wayne State University in 2011. Seems as if we were smart enough to snap him up soon after he completed his PhD. And has been an assistant professor in the sociology department since then. He's interested in work and organizations, medical sociology, race and ethnicity, everyday racism, discrimination, inequality and social stratification, and scholarship, and the scholarship of teaching and learning. He has either written or has been part of dozens of journal articles. I wouldn't bore you with a list of them, but I can tell you about his most recent one. It was published in the International Journal of Hospitality Management, entitled "The Effects of Restaurant Servers' Perceptions of Customers' Tipping Behavior on Service Discrimination." This was published this year. An article that he's working on in collaboration with Jeremiah B. Wills is the institution of tipping as a source of employee agency, the case of restaurant service, which is forthcoming in sociological focus. So we're seeing the beginning of a thriving, promising academic career. And he is currently a resident scholar in the Humanities Center, where he is an excellent citizen. So I am deeply, deeply grateful to Zach Brewster and his co-presenter, this time in spirit, Salita Cockcroft, who is trapped because of travel issues and can't be here. So please welcome to the podium Professor Zachary Brewster, who will speak to you today on everyday racism in American restaurants.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out today. Let me begin by giving a quick anecdote. As Walter said, I have only been here for, this is my second year. So last fall, would have been my first year here at Wayne. And shortly after starting the fall semester, I guess it would have been of 2011, Heather Dillaway was actually presenting at one of these brown bag amenity centers, colloquiums. So she was presenting on women and menopause, and so it sounded fairly interesting given the fact that I didn't know anything about women and menopause. And more importantly, I thought it might be a good idea to go because she was my new department head. So I came and I kind of got a flavor of what this series was all about. And I knew from the get-go that I wanted to get on the program for the following year. And this was my first contribution to this series. But the reason why I wanted to get on the program was not necessarily because it's a great medium to share your research and to get interdisciplinary feedback, but rather the most important reason from my perspective was to get one of Walter's introductions. So, it's not very often that, especially as a junior faculty, you get that type of introduction. So thank you, Walter, and thank you, Nikki, and the rest of the Humanities Center community. So what I'll be talking about today is everyday racism in American restaurants, and basically what I'm going to do is delineate what I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years and beyond. So I'm going to begin the presentation talking a little bit about where I've been, and then end the presentation with where I'm at right now. So as you see, my presentation is entitled Everyday Racism in American Restaurants, and regretfully, my colleague Shalita Cocroft will not be joining us. She's stuck in, she's having some travel issues coming back from Chicago. And I also want to acknowledge Mike Lynn. He's a colleague that's involved in the most recent project that I'll end the presentation on. He's in the School of Hospitality at Cornell University. So his stamp is also on this research. So with that said, what I want to talk about is everyday discrimination in the restaurant industry. People of color can experience mistreatment across a variety of milieus, and in fact they do experience mistreatment across a variety of milieus, but they are particularly vulnerable to mistreatment in everyday routine, while engaging in everyday routine activities. So some of the mistreatment experienced in engaging in everyday routine activities have been colloquially referred to as driving while black or brown, shopping while black or brown, or hailing a cab while black or brown. I argue, I think convincingly, that they are even more vulnerable to mistreatment when engaging in the restaurant consumption, when consuming meals away from home. And this has been colloquially referred to as dining while black or brown, so kind of following the same flavor. And there's a bunch of other examples that we could talk about, flying while black or brown, and what have you. So I argue that this increased vulnerability that customers of color encounter in the restaurant context in particular is enhanced because of the institution of tipping. So tipping, by and large, in most tipped professions, occur after services have already been rendered, right? So people occur after they've already consumed the service. So from the server's perspective, there is no way in knowing in advance how they will be compensated for their efforts. So this leads some, arguably, to discriminate based on perceived statistical differences in tipping across social groups, given the fact that any individual's tipping behaviors cannot be ascertained. So servers, in particular, are encouraged by the system to draw inferences about the tipping behaviors of groups to which individuals have been placed in or categorized in. Moreover, the institution of tipping allows servers to couch discriminatory behaviors and prejudices more generally within this economic framework. So this is consistent with this contemporary notions of color blindness. So servers are able to rationalize or otherwise justify giving customers of color different treatment, not because they are racist, but rather because they are economically dependent on tips, and given the fact that they have these perceptions or draw these inferences about interracial tipping differences, then they feel justified in acting upon those inferences. So these two kind of factors contribute to enhanced vulnerability among African Americans and other customers of color, particularly African Americans. So to explore some of these issues, back in 2004, a colleague of mine at NC State, while we were still fairly young graduate students, we decided to get together and collaborate on a survey of restaurant servers. So we randomly selected restaurants from the Raleigh-Durham area, and of those that we solicited participation, there were 40. 18 of those 40 agreed to participate. In other words, they agreed to give us access to their servers. So once access was granted, we proceeded to administer surveys to all those servers who were currently working, with the intention of getting at least 10 from each restaurant. So this resulted in a small community data set of 200 servers that were nested in 18 different restaurants. So the first thing that became apparent, and it was surprising even to us, even though we were going into this research kind of having some expectations about discrimination in this setting, but the first thing that was surprising is how many of our servers readily admitting to varying their service according to customers' race. So nearly 40%, 38.5% of the sample subjects report that the service at least sometimes varies according to the customer's race. So, over the next couple years, we did virtually nothing with this data. I got bogged down with prelims and teaching, and she was involved in other projects. So the data basically sat there for some time, and then eventually this would materialize into my dissertation. So I would pick it up and analyze this data, and it would become my dissertation. So after graduating in 2009, I spent a couple years at West Virginia State University, and I began working on articles pulled from my dissertation. So these analyses that are forthcoming are all articles that have already been published in some form or fashion, and they were articles that led directly from this data collected in North Carolina. So the first thing that I wanted to look at is, what are the perceptions of servers with regard to the race of customers? So in our instrument, we had a variety of scenarios, and those scenarios allowed us to basically compare tables wherein the only variable was race. So for instance, we'd ask them to describe the tipping practices of 4 white women with 2 children, and then later in another scenario presented later in the instrument would be to describe the tipping practices of 4 black women with 2 children. So all these other table characteristics that otherwise servers could utilize to draw inferences about the potential profitability of waiting on any given table, the only thing that's varying here is, of course, the race of the customers. And we did this with 4 different scenarios. White family with 8 adult children, black family with 8 adult children, 2 white heterosexual couples, 2 black heterosexual couples, and 4 elderly and 3 elderly. The only difference is the last example. The 4 doesn't match flight with 3, and this just is a flat-out error when we created the instrument and never got caught. So it's a close enough comparison, and what you can see is in every instance, the white table is perceived to be better in their tipping behaviors relative to a very similar black table. So this was consistent with existing research, but a lot of the research that had been done was qualitative in nature. So it had not been quantified, so we didn't really know how pervasive these perceptions of customers based on race were. We also took the literature a step further by looking at servers' perceptions of dining behaviors. So the first type of discrimination that could potentially emerge from these tipping differentials parallels the situation where servers might perceive that they have to work the same amount for less pay when waiting on customers of color relative to their white counterparts. This latter scenario, though, involves a situation wherein servers may perceive that they may have to work for the same pay, but work harder, right? So that's why we incorporated notions of dining room behaviors. So in short, what we show, using the same type technique that we did with regard to tipping, is that servers not only perceive African Americans to be, relatively speaking, poor tippers, but also, relatively speaking, more difficult to wait on. So more demanding, making more requests, so on and so forth. So this obviously led into some predictions about discrimination. So given these revenue-based inferences that emerged from perceived tipping differentials and giving these cost-based inferences that emerge from dining behavioral type differences, I predicted that these would explain variability in servers' self-reported discrimination, or proclivity to discriminate based on the race of their customer. So this is the more of the neoclassical economic argument for discrimination. Again, servers are discriminating not because they are racist, but rather they are discriminating to increase their profits, and they are indeed dependent on tips. So what this story basically tells, and this is just an analysis primarily predicting the effects of subjects' perceptions of blacks' tipping and behaviors on self-reported discrimination. I find that in both cases there is an inverse relationship between positivity towards tipping and behavior and self-reported discrimination, such that the more positive they are towards African Americans tipping and dining behaviors, the less likely they are to report using race as a determinant of the service that they subsequently provide. And this relationship remains reliable or marginally reliable net of the effects of a crude measure of racial prejudice. I was interested in trying to ascertain whether both discrimination and these perceptions of tipping were simply a byproduct of people's racial prejudices, right? Which would otherwise, to the degree that that is true, it would have rendered the relationship between perceptions of tipping and behavior and discrimination a spurious relationship. And I find that net of the effects of a crude measure of racial prejudice, these relationships still are observed. And this is consistent with the statistical discrimination argument. So perceptions of tipping and dining behaviors and interracial differences in tipping and dining behaviors are important with regard to understanding discriminant service, right? However, they explain only about 4% and 2.5% respectively of the overall variation in subjects' self-reported discrimination. So while I do find a statistical relationship, in the scheme of things, that relationship is quite modest. It's not explaining nearly the degree of variability in subjects' proclivity to discriminate racially in their service that you would otherwise think it would if it were purely an economic-based argument. So obviously there are other factors implicated. So the next thing I turn to in another paper is exploring the effects of a racialized workplace culture. So in the literature, again, primarily qualitative literature, there was a lot of rich descriptions about the racialized nature of restaurant workplaces. And a primary characteristic of this racialized culture in restaurants is the use of racialized language. So particularly what caught our attention when we developed this instrument to assess these processes quantitatively were the use of code words. So across a lot of different studies on restaurant servers and certainly in the popular press that covers issues like this, we kept seeing this reoccurring theme of servers using coded language to reference their customers of color. So we had several questions on here asking about racialized discourse. And again, the answers were quite surprising in terms of magnitude. So we found that 63.4% of sample subjects report observing their coworkers making racist comments. Right? So that seems pretty high. 26% report observing their managers make racist comments. In 3/4 reported observing their coworkers using racialized or race-based code words. So I began thinking that beyond this economic argument, that perhaps a more fruitful line of inquiry would be to explore the relational dimension of the workplace cultures, specifically obviously restaurant cultures, towards understanding service discrimination. So this is the basic model that I, along with my colleagues, have offered with regard to understanding racialized restaurant service. And it, in essence, explains lower tipping behaviors as a result of this self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we begin down here on the left-hand side of the diagram, it is driven by racialized workplace discourse. So this creates what we call these racialized status beliefs about who are good tippers and who are bad tippers, which in turn leads servers to discriminate In so doing, they create the conditions out of which lower tips from African Americans are received and other customers of color. And then this kind of reaffirms their status belief, and it creates this perpetual type cycle. So what I'm interested in fact, I'm interested in touching and eventually testing and exploring all these mechanisms, but in the earlier data, I can directly test the relationship between racialized workplace discourse and discriminant service. So that's kind of where I go next. And if there's any questions as I go through this, feel free just to ask them. I realize I'm going through it fairly quickly. So again, this time I'm still predicting self-reported discrimination, controlling for subjects, race, sex, education, age, and also controlling for all those other observable table characteristics that servers might otherwise draw from to make inferences about profitability. And now I also include my measures of racist discourse. In models 2, 3, and 4, you see each one of these measures of racist discourse have an independent positive effect on discriminatory service, fairly strong, and also in the full model they have independent additive effects as well. So basically the story that this tells is that this racialized workplace discourse, or this racialized culture characterized by frequent racialized discussions or racist language or coded language, so on and so forth, is a fairly strong predictor of servers' proclivity to report using customers' race to inform the service quality. So in fact, all three of the measures are able to explain roughly 20% of the overall variation in server self-reported discriminatory behaviors. And this is 20% in addition to the roughly 7.5%, 8% that was otherwise explained with all the control variables, including servers' positivity towards the tipping and dining behaviors of African Americans. So this racialized workplace culture argument is a much more robust framework towards understanding what is going on, or towards beginning to understand what is going on in restaurants and how this is unique from other workplaces. However, considerably less is known about the form or nature of race-based discrimination in this setting. So, through all these projects, each paper that I did, I had to speculate on what servers meant by varying their service according to race of their customers, because we didn't have any indicators of the nature of discrimination. So, based on my understanding of contemporary discrimination more generally, I speculated in each case that discrimination was likely to be manifested in very subtle ways. This is consistent with contemporary discrimination more generally. So in most cases, people do not discriminate in blatant or overt ways. Discrimination tends to be couched in much more subtle terms. Scholars have further noted that much of contemporary racial discrimination emerges from firmly embedded cognitive biases that can function to unconsciously undermine the behaviors of even those with a commitment to equity. So in other words, we oftentimes behave in a discriminatory way, and we do so unconsciously. We do so without even being aware that we are discriminating. So when we are engaged in interracial interactions, we may, for instance, without intentionally trying to do so, we may smile less, we may exert less or signify fewer cues of friendliness, so on and so forth. So based on this literature that's more generally about contemporary discrimination, I was speculating that discrimination that servers are admitting to is likely to be quite subtle and largely undetectable, given the fact that they would not likely want to engage in blatant acts or egregious acts of misconduct while at work for fear of being reprimanded, for fear of losing their job, so on and so forth. Given this speculation, we designed and analyzed data derived from two distinct survey projects. And again, I highlight that this was driven all by speculation, because even in the larger literature on contemporary discrimination, there's no there's very little evidence of what discrimination looks like. So every scholar, in essence, across disciplinary boundaries will talk about the contemporary nature of discrimination being subtle. But what does that mean? Nobody delineates what it actually looks like in practice or how to detect it. And so this seems like a very good way to begin thinking about discrimination and begin thinking about the contemporary discrimination and the subtleties that it entails. So what we did is design 2 surveys of restaurant consumers that were designed to explore the degree to which customers' perceptions of hospitality differ across racial groups. So by focusing on perceptions of hospitality, we were able to sidestep the problem that a lot of researchers have with actually asking people if they've been discriminated against. For a variety of reasons, people are likely to underreport experiencing discrimination, in part, again, because of the subtleties that it likely entails. So we asked a series of questions about hospitality, specifically about servers' behaviors and the hospitality extended to them by servers that have been posited to systematically vary by customers' race. So in the first study, this was a large survey where we derived a sample from members of Survey Sampling International's consumer panel. So this was an online survey on tipping, and it was a stratified sampling technique was deployed with the intention of trying to get approximately 200 whites, 200 African Americans, 200 Hispanics, and 200 Asians. So we ended up with a very diverse, large sample in terms of race, with the exception of non-white Hispanics. The question we used actually asked about race, and then in a subsequent question we asked about whether the respondent was of Hispanic or Latino descent. So a lot of our Hispanic subjects actually were white Hispanics. So given the fact that you wouldn't expect servers to discriminate based on ethnicity per se, because it is not readily recognizable by them, we limited our analysis to just the 47 non-white Hispanics. And so what were we looking at? So we looked at 4 different dependent variables. And each variable is measuring a unique dimension of service quality or hospitality. So we had 2 dependent variables that dealt with timing issues. So we labeled these inattentive service or expedited service. So stop by the table too rarely, deliver the food too slowly, bring the check only after you ask for it. All these were used to create a scale measuring inattentive service. So we hypothesized that one way in which subtle discrimination might become evident is through this subtle inattentiveness. So it's not necessarily that the customers of color are not getting service, but they might be getting relatively slower service. So as an aggregate, if this is the case, we suspected that it would show up in interracial differences in perceptions of inattentiveness. In the question you should know, ask, how often do you find these waiters and waitresses serving you do the following things? So the question was very general. We were trying to get a sense of customers' experiences more generally with servers. And then we also included indicators of expedited service. So deliver the food too quickly, bring the check too soon, stop by the table too often. And again, it sounds kind of weird initially to think of that being as potentially an example of subtle discrimination, but we reasoned that servers might be motivated to rush their service to customers of color along so as to, in essence, discriminate them right out of the restaurant, right? So that was a possibility too, and there is some support for that in different social contexts. So we wanted to look at that. Then we also looked at a host of different interpersonal server behaviors. So we labeled these discretional interpersonal and required interpersonal server behaviors. So did the server squat down, or do servers generally speaking squat down next to the table or sit down at the table, touch your arm or shoulder, ask you questions about yourself, or chat with you? So these are what can be thought of as discretional gestures of hospitality. So they can be used discretionally to kind of cultivate rapport with customers, and we hypothesized that they may systematically vary by race. Again, to the degree that they do, we would interpret that as potential evidence of contemporary discrimination in the restaurant context. We also looked at whether they look you in the eyes when talking to you, make you feel welcome in the restaurant, and smile when serving you. So these are more standard cues of hospitality. Most restaurants in their formal trainings, they encourage servers to do this. So we also wanted to see if the behaviors that were more required or standard cues of hospitality varied by the customer's race. And so we controlled for the subjects' demographic characteristics, including their region. And then we looked at race effects on each one of these dependent variables. So inattentive service, we see a negative coefficient for being Hispanics, suggesting that Hispanics are less likely than their white counterparts. So we're comparing them, each racial group is compared against the white baseline group. So they're less likely to report inattentive service in restaurant. So that's in contrast to our predictions. It's not consistent with what we thought might happen. And we also see Hispanics, though, reporting that they are less likely to experience the discretional type behaviors relative to whites that we analyzed. So that's some evidence of discrimination, or at least at minimum perceived discrimination, right? Because we're not actually measuring servers' behavior, rather we're measuring subjects' perceptions of servers' behaviors more generally. So we find some limited support that Hispanics relative to whites are less likely to observe their servers or experience their servers extending these discretional type behaviors like sitting down next to the table or squatting down next to the table, touching your arm or shoulder, or asking questions about yourself and chatting with you. But by and large, aside from these Hispanic effects, we don't see a lot of evidence of server bias. So in other words, this study, with the exception of this one Hispanic difference, indicates that service is perceived to be extended equally regardless of what one's racial category is. But there are several problems with this study. One is that the general perceptions we thought might have overshadowed interracial differences in perceptions of their servers' behavior during specific dining encounters. So in other words, by and large, customers of color and white alike might experience service in a very similar way. But nevertheless, on any specific occasion, African Americans and other customers of color might be more likely to experience some form of degradation during the service encounter or mistreatment during the service encounter. Relatedly, we thought that subjects' ability to recall and accurately estimate the frequency in which their servers convey the subtle interpersonal behaviors explored in the study may have been limited. So we were asking them to speak in very general terms. And we thought that this might impede them from really recalling specific instances, and moreover, it might impede them from really recognizing their general experiences, even to the degree that there might be interracial differences. In other words, if I ask you to recall the last time you ate at a restaurant and tell me if your server smiled, are you going to really remember? Did your server give you his or her name the last time that you were at a restaurant? Do you remember? Yeah, so thinking about this in general, in very general ways, might not have necessarily been the best way to test for racial bias. And furthermore, we thought that even if customers of color are extended the same objective cues of hospitality, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are extended in the same way. Right? So we started thinking about it, and it seemed reasonable to suspect that these null effects could reflect or could be hiding evidence of discriminatory treatment by virtue of, or consistent with the old adage that it's not what somebody says that's important, it's rather how they say it. So even if the same objective cues are being extended, they may be experienced in qualitatively different ways. So this leads to a second study. And the second study was again done to further explore the nature of contemporary racial discrimination in full-service restaurants. Although this study was administered to, this survey was administered to customers immediately after a specific dining encounter. So now the dining encounter is fresh in the subject's mind. Literally, they are approached by a researcher, either Shalita or myself, after they had dined at a local restaurant and asked to participate in this study. And they were asked very similar questions as study 1. We limited ourselves in study 2 to looking more at the interpersonal behaviors. So we did not include any timing questions in this instrument. And we also included some indicators, some additional indicators to explore how servers' behaviors were subjectively evaluated by customers. So customers were approached, as I mentioned, immediately afterwards. We approached a total of 121 customers, and 515 agreed to participate. So this thus given us a response rate of 63%. And for those of you who have done surveys like this, I'm pretty happy with that response rate, because doing the survey was a pain in the butt. And a lot of people do not want to take surveys after their bellies are full. So this gave us 515. The analytic sample actually analyzed in this particular study consisted of 233 white customers and 155 black customers, so 388 in total. And to give you an idea of what variables we're talking about here, so the discretional and required, these are two dimensions of service that we also included indicators of in study 1. So some of these are overlapping, others are slightly different. So we asked subjects if their server recommended a food item when taking their order, whether they complimented them on their food choice, whether they joked around with them and made them laugh. So again, all these are ways in which servers can cultivate rapport with their customers that have been shown in existing studies on service quality to do just that, to cultivate rapport. Required interpersonal behaviors that we analyzed included the server smiling throughout the encounter, giving his or her name when greeting the table, maintaining appropriate posture throughout the encounter, maintaining eye contact, and then of course thanking them at the end of the service transaction for their patronage. So those indicators are all combined and make up collectively the discretional interpersonal dependent variable and the required interpersonal dependent variable. And then the subjective appraisal variables that were included in the study include: my server made me feel comfortable and welcome in the restaurant, my server met my server's expectations this evening, and my server was authentic and seemed to sincerely care about my dining experiences. So all the indicators of service quality on the left-hand side of the screen are objective cues. They either did or did not. They did smile or they did not. They did thank or they did not. So they're much more objective in nature. The latter ones over here on the right side are much more consistent with what we think of in terms of subjective evaluations of servers' behaviors or subjective appraisals. So what did we find here? Consistent with study 1's findings, we found no effect of being an African American on subjects' perceptions of discretional interpersonal server behaviors. So we found no evidence of racial bias that might become evident in whites and African Americans' perceptions of discretional interpersonal behaviors. We find a marginally significant positive effect of being black on perceptions of required interpersonal server behaviors, thus suggesting that blacks might be more likely to have these objective cues of hospitality extended to them relative to their white counterparts. Again, at minimum, they are perceived to be the beneficiaries of these objective cues of hospitality more than whites. But interestingly, we found a fairly strong negative effect of being African American on the subjective appraisal measurement. So African Americans are less likely to express that their service expectations were met. They're less likely to express that their server made them feel welcome and comfortable in the restaurant, and less likely to report that their server appeared sincere and authentic. Right? And I'll note too that this is controlling for the required interpersonal behaviors and discretional interpersonal behaviors. So net of any effects, namely it would be a marginally significant effect of required interpersonal behaviors. Net of that, we see this difference in subjective appraisal. So this was pretty interesting and largely unanticipated. So we, yeah.
I'm wondering about the servers, because the data, yes, it's diverse in nature, but I continually struggle with trying to figure out who served X, Y, and Z. So who served the, you know, black, white, Asian, etc. Who are the servers, and did the servers race or ethnicity, social class affect, you know, how they treated?
Yeah, good question. So the first study, we have no idea who the servers are because we're talking about their experiences with servers in a abstract general sense. All right, so we have no indicators of, it's not pertaining to a specific dining encounter, so it's just servers more generally. So to glean any insights into who servers are, we could only make some crude deductions based on the demographic profile of restaurant servers. And restaurant servers tend to be slightly more likely to be female and considerably more likely to be white. The majority of servers are white.
I mean, I guess it would depend because, you know, North Carolina, well, I'm not sure exactly where you did your data set, but, you know, North Carolina, what I know is the part of the, you know, South, so that means demographics are very different.
Yeah, certainly. So there could be, certainly there is a possibility of being regional differences. Although, if you draw from, kind of piece together existing literature, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that we would expect huge differences between Raleigh, North Carolina, and other parts of the country. So again, I can't test that directly because I don't have the data, but there's no reason to suggest that servers are going to be in Detroit, for instance, that servers are going to have more positive outlooks towards the tipping behaviors of black customers. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
I was just trying to get a sense of who the servers are, trying to sort of paint this picture. I'm qualitative in nature. I love stories in nature. I know the numbers tell a story as well, but I'm just trying to get a sense of, okay, well, who served this particular person because... Yeah,
it could make a big difference. And I can speak to some of those issues with this second study. Because the second study is pertaining to a specific dining encounter, right? And it's local. So this data is we're talking about Midtown here. I'm not going to tell you what restaurant, but we're talking local. So given the demographic profile of Detroit, the servers are, unlike the national average, servers are much more likely to be African American relative to restaurants across the country, all right? And in this particular study, I don't present any data on this in this particular talk, but we did collect data on the race and gender of the servers, all right? And that data, those indicators do not explain away this racial difference in subjective appraisals of server behaviors. So in other words, irrespective of whether the server was white or black, male or female, we still see this pretty strong, robust effect such that African Americans have lower subjective appraisals of their server behaviors, net of their perceptions of the actual objective cues, like smiling, thanking, those more acquired ones, and also the more discretional ones. So in that particular case, the race and gender of the server don't seem to matter. And I can return to that too, because there is some interesting stuff with regard to race of the server and gender of the server that we can talk about. So basically, this raises two possibilities. There's two interpretations. One is that African Americans have comparatively higher expectations of restaurant servers that servers cannot meet by extending the standard cues of service, right? And there's some reason to support such an interpretation, given the history of racial discrimination that customers of color, more generally African Americans in particular, have experienced. It could be that those previous experiences, or the cumulative effect of those previous experiences, have created expectations that are judged against the realism of living in a society characterized by a considerable amount of racial bias and discrimination. All right? Alternatively, and as I initially alluded to, it could be that servers' performance are qualitatively different, or at minimum experienced qualitatively differently. So a service that is objectively speaking may be quite equal, but as a result of implicit and explicit racial biases, they may be doing so in comparatively less authentic, welcoming, and sincere ways when waiting on African Americans. So if this is the case, it might explain why African Americans may be less likely to perceive that their dining expectations were met, precisely because of the insincerity embodied in servers' interpersonal behaviors. Right? Follow me? So we can explore this by decoupling the service expectations indicator of the subjective appraisal scale from the other two indicators. Being made to feel welcome and comfortable, and being sincere and authentic. And so I decoupled those and then redid the analysis. So as you can see in this first column, as we would expect, given previous findings, there's a strong negative effect of being black on expectations. So African Americans are significantly less likely to report that their service expectations were met. Right? There's also a strong negative effect of being black on the 2-item subjective appraisal scale. So this is a scale that is comprised of just perceptions of being welcome and comfortable and perceptions of sincerity and authenticity. All right, so if we look at expectations and we add our measure of the 2-item subjective appraisal, you see that that coefficient for expectations is no longer significant. So what that tells us is that the initial effect of being black on expectations is mediated by, fully explained by, subjects' perceptions of their server's sincerity and authenticity, and also perceptions of being made to feel comfortable and welcome. And then on this last one, I do the reverse. I predict the 2-item subjective appraisal scale, but I control for service expectations. And you see that the effect of being African American is still statistically significant. So this effect, what this tells us is it's not driven exclusively by differences in service expectations. So there is a significant differences in subjective appraisals, even if we eliminate that expectations measure.
I have a methodological question which I'll ask you privately later in terms of, because your dependent variables are all sort of driven by a Likert scale, essentially, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can talk about that later. My concern, I like what you're doing, and it's very interesting, but given the qualitative nature, how are you controlling for consistency of expectations? For example, I expect a really regal experience, and I get my chair bumped, so I'm horrified. Otherwise, or someone may say, you know, they didn't spit at me, I think I had a great time. So how do you control those? And then the flip side is, how do you control for the fact that, for instance, in a society in which you expect to be treated poorly, those expectations get confirmed, whatever the experience is. So you're talking about a very subjective, and it's important the way you're doing that, but then you're trying to quantify it. So how are you controlling for consistency of measurement when 3 of us all say we had a good time, and my idea of a good time is not being beaten up, and your idea of a good time is that the food was made perfectly?
Yeah, and you can't. That's what I was alluding to in terms of pre-service expectations or more global expectations. Any interracial differences in those expectations you can't really control for. So as I mentioned, one possibility is that in part, I think, lending some support to this is because of the history of racism, that African Americans may have heightened sense of expectations in restaurants.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I think the qualitative discussion and the various stories you tell are very interesting, and you can draw a lot out of that. I'm just reacting to the then subsequent strength of affirming your expectations and driving your analysis with these quantitative measures. And we all know the transition from qualitative to quantitative is always tricky. And so I'm just worrying about consistency of measurements and things like that to get such definitive answers. I mean, being very clearly definitive about what you find.
Right.
When I think your anecdotal stories give us very good indications of what may be happening. I'm thinking of someone like Joe Fagan, who says every white person is a recovering racist because white society privileges whites. Unless you're conscious of it, you don't see it.
Right.
And that's what you're driving at. So I'm just, you know, perception is so important in your analysis. And I don't, and having not read all the other papers, maybe you're more careful about how to frame perception and put it into more contextual. But it's just the danger I see is therefore making these very hard, firm, quantitative, definitive statements about the probability of X or Y.
Yeah,
So,
no, I agree completely, and I'm definitive in the sense that this is what the data shows me, right? So I can definitively say that there's a significant effect of being African American on my measure of subjective appraisal. So you're absolutely right. That does not get at these more micro level processes in terms of what that actually entails or how that actually is experienced. And to get at that, it's important to draw from the qualitative researchers who are much more proficient at getting at those questions.
but then the coding becomes really important if you want to be able to say those things, and that's the only, and that's what we'll talk about offline, as it were.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So that says, whoops. A good segue into our discussion, because so taken as a whole, as I've already mentioned, of this post hoc exploration is suggesting that servers do extend the same service, but they are experienced in qualitatively different ways. So the nature of such subtleties and servers' interpersonal interactions with customers, however, remain unclear. And I think that's what David's suggesting. Yeah, I can't speak to that as a quantitative researcher.
I have a question about your questions.
Sure.
I'm wondering, I guess back to his point about this whole idea of expectations in terms of regal versus being treated poorly.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering on your protocol or I guess questionnaire, I'm wondering whether or not you included questions like even on a Likert scale or something like that about, you know, these particular perceptions of being treated poorly or, you know, poorly, you know, to regal. Was there something on the scale that measured that?
No, like to tap into like previous experiences with discrimination, no. And that's one area of inquiry that I want to take, is to see how previous experiences affect issues like perceptions or expectations of service, and then even the economic behavior in terms of actual tipping practices. Because it just stands to reason to me that if you have experienced a lot of mistreatment in any given service context, that is going to create a situation where you may be less thrilled to evaluate even service that may be okay as anything other than maybe okay. Where in the absence of that discrimination, okay service may look to somebody else as great service. Yeah, I don't have that. That's an interesting question now.
I think your Likert scale will sort of get more at teasing it out. I mean, of course, it's not going to be qualitative in nature, but as a qualitative person, I'm thinking, okay, what way can we make this sort of quantitatively sort of tell a more richer story?
Right, for sure. That's a good point.
First of all, let's thank David. Let's talk Zach for a wonderful talk. And give other people who have questions a chance to ask questions.
Yes.
I really enjoy your talk, and when I listening to your talk, I try to relate my experience as an Asian American, you know, and how thinking about how Asian, a group that has so many immigrants fit into this. Back to the question about the interracial dynamic, the race group of the server and the race group of my customer. My experience, sometimes when I'm in a restaurant that has a lot of Chinese servers, I still feel Chinese customers are undervalued and they are discriminated against. So it seems to me the race, ethnicity of the server might be overshadowed by their status as the server. So to speak, they pay a lot of attention to the tip, for example. So that's one of my observation. Another of my comment, actually, I want to ask you if you observe any over-tipping behavior. For example, when someone gets discriminated against, and they might have two kind of response. One is, I don't want to tip this person that much because I didn't get the service I deserve. And another kind of agency of response, maybe I will tip them a lot of money to show that their stereotyping was wrong. So
Right.
I wonder if you observe that kind of behavior.
Yeah, there is, to take the latter point up, there is anecdotal evidence that oftentimes members of racial groups that are perceived to tip less, and they are aware of that stereotype and that perception, they will overcompensate and as a mechanism to prove the server wrong in many ways. So I haven't ever run anything in terms of a systematic study to see how frequent that occurs, but just anecdotally when I was doing the survey, I had several African Americans emphasize, one of the questions was how much do you tip? And they emphasized 20%. I always tip 20%. And then further elaborated that they do because they're aware of this perception amongst wait staff. In the former question though, with regard to Asian servers, even oftentimes kind of coming across as less than authentic to Asian customers, there is evidence of that in the restaurant literature more generally. And to some degree, that's what you'd expect given that cultural argument that I previously reviewed, because within this culture, these perceptions are created and sustained. So there is evidence that African Americans have negative perceptions of African American customers in terms of tipping. So in part, that reflects this the creation and sustainment of these status beliefs that are really binary in nature. You're either a good or a bad tipper, right? So that's a good point.
Have you ever read Ian Ayer's Fair Driving Study?
Yeah, to ensure prejudice.
The study of automobile dealers in the Chicago area.
Yeah, I'm semi-familiar with that. It looks at more like cost-based rate, statistical discrimination.
Well, it's conjecture because he doesn't really survey the people, but he can empirically demonstrate higher prices charged for automobiles to people of color and to women, including behaviors by African American salespeople who gouged African American customers as well, and he kind of leads to conjecture, just what's causing all of this.
Yeah,
it's disturbing.
Yeah, and the piece that I'm more familiar with him is you actually look at taxi cab drivers looking at the hailing a cab while black, and he does the same thing. He doesn't actually measure discrimination per se, but he has thousands of taxi fares and tips on those fares and controlling for a bunch of variables that cab drivers might draw from to otherwise make inferences about potential profitability. He shows that a statistical discriminator would be motivated to avoid picking up an African American because of this profit motive. So he does the same thing with regard to taxi drivers as well. Definitely.
Just anecdotally, as a taxi driver in New York for 3 years while I was an undergraduate, I think class had much more important role than race, because you always got better tips from people of lower middle class than you got from upper middle and upper class. And so, and that was a question about this restaurant stuff. A lot of what you're talking about seems to be class coded, or at least to what extent could you separate this out? In other words, do I perceive of someone who's a person of color is likely to have less money, therefore the tip will be smaller, and it's class-based as much, if not more? I mean, I don't deny any of the race aspect of it.
Yeah. Class-based is definitely some of it, but the much bigger story is the racial issue. So, because the racial issue cuts across classes. So a group of African American that are professionally dressed, you could draw inferences about their class with some degree of accuracy. servers are still going to purport the same type of negativity towards them. So class does make a big difference, but the racial issue, I see it as a bigger issue than even class. Yeah.
Does the quality of the type of restaurant, fine dining versus Coney Island, do you see any deviations in the data based on that, the style of restaurant?
Yeah, there's not enough literature, not enough scholarship done on this.
Which could go to the class issue as well.
Yeah, and I have really no way of really answering that based on any existing research.
I'm thinking more of the expectations of the customer than the server.
Right.
You think the server's expectation would be similar across all delivery platforms, if you will. But the perception of the service could vary differently, significantly, from fine dining where dinner is $95 to $6 burger, you know.
Yeah, certainly. So the expectations are going to vary based on the type of restaurant you're going to.
Right.
You're going to
Right.
how that those expectations play out to affect some of the processes that I'm interested in. I have really no idea. But it'd be, and that's the other problem is most restaurants are not large chain restaurants, but that's where most servers are employed in. So most restaurants are small mom and pop type shops, but the vast majority of servers are employed in these large scale chain restaurants. So there's enough no studies done on these smaller restaurants to see what the racial climate is even like in those restaurants. So all this might be completely not generalizable to other types of restaurants. So we're talking in these studies much more chain type oriented, particularly in my early research. It was all chains like Applebee's, Ruby Tuesdays, Outback, Red Lobster. So it's all these large scale corporate entities. So that'd be an interesting question.
Did you find that it was more whites that discriminated or blacks that discriminated? Because I'm finding that I can go into a restaurant, actually this just happened, that they sat for a whole hour, this was last week, sat for a whole hour, they did not come. We didn't have to pay our bills, mind you. They did not come to us, but some white people came in, they sat them down, serviced them, they was in and out, we stood, and the manager did not believe that we sat there 4 hours. It was my daughter-in-law's birthday. Could not believe, but this was a black server, not a white server. That they discriminate as well, sometimes even more.
Yeah.
Than white servers.
Yeah, and your experiences, unfortunately, I don't think are that rare. You should sue them. But, and that goes back to what we were talking about. There is evidence that black and white servers alike are adhering to these same socially constructed status beliefs. And that is not your experience. Another anecdote is there was a case down in Georgia. A lawyer contacted me about potentially doing some consulting work, and his client had the exact same experience. The perpetrator in this case was a black server, and he was trying to figure out if he had a case. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that it's and the other thing we have to think about is all this is unfolding under this large glooming umbrella of living in a race-conscious society with a history of racial oppression. So these servers are bringing in these cognitive biases to the workplace with them. But that being said, there's also a lot going on within the environment of the restaurant culture itself that is perpetuating differential service based on customers' race.
Okay, well, I've been a server for like 2 years and a bartender, and I see this all the time. Not necessarily me, but like other managers I've worked with, other servers and bartenders I've worked with do this a lot. The statistic you gave at the beginning, the 38.5% that variance is on tip, I would say is in like the 90%. Easy. I've never met anybody that doesn't vary their service on accordance tip. Not saying it's all based on race. I do it more based on age. Okay, so someone that comes in at 17 years old, necessarily on average, based on working in the service for so long, won't tip as well as a 60-year-old or whatever, right? Okay, I'm not saying this is always, in general, because I've worked here so long, this is like, the data you collect. But, like this happened to me a couple weeks ago. This gentleman came in, ordered a burger. I put the order in, delivered it to him. My service was no different than any other person. His burger was overcooked. And he made a comment about, did you screw up my food because I'm black? No, I put it in exactly how you ordered it. The cooks didn't see you. They have no idea who this is going to. How would you think this is racist? I handled it just as any other customer, took it off his bill, got him a new burger. But he made a comment about being, because he was black. Well, that had nothing to do with it. You know, it was an accident, and then sometimes, like, I'm not saying this happened to you because of anything else, but sometimes accidents happen where a table will sit down and you miss them, or you think someone else already has them, and these accidents happen. But I'm not saying anything, but if a table sat down and I didn't know they were my table, I wouldn't greet them.
Right.
That's not because of a different race, that's because accidents happen, I didn't realize, I didn't understand, you see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So, but like I said, like I definitely just, I shouldn't discriminate, make assumptions based on age,
Yeah,
a lot.
sure.
And if a man comes in and has come in past 2 years to see me in particular, and he orders a beer, and someone else next to him orders a beer, I'm going to pour that guy's beer first, because he's been tipping me for 2 years, and he comes in to see me, you know what I mean? So
Right.
that also happens, and people can take that wrong. The person sitting next to him could be Asian, could be African American, could be white, doesn't matter. Well, all of a sudden it's like, well, why'd you pour his beer first?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things going on. Here. And I'm hesitant and reluctant to get into every point that you make, but certainly there are other customer cues that servers draw from, including age, to make emphasis about the potential profitability associated with waiting on any given table. But that being said, when we look at these ascribed characteristics like race and gender, then it nevertheless, even though servers are doing this, and we understand that they're doing this, and we understand the economic motivation underlying it, it's nevertheless is illegal behavior.
Right.
It technically is illegal behavior because you can't statistically discriminate based on protected classification system of people.
Of course.
So, on the one hand, it's difficult to reconcile because, and I argue that this is a consequence of the tipping system, a way of remunerating servers, because servers are dependent on tips. And it's hard to reconcile that against the fact that by law, people are entitled to the same service irrespective of what category of people they're in. So that's good. It's interesting, and your comment is well taken about the giving a drink to one person over the other, because it's that type of subtleties that I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I mean, like, there's some things that are different per table, but it doesn't always mean it's because they're race. Like, if I go up to a table and say, hey, what's up, you know, I'm your server, you know, say my name, say, you know, make a joke or two, well, if the table isn't giving me the cues that that's okay,
Right.
I won't do that. Tables give cues on what's appropriate.
And you read those, sure.
And I can pick them up instantly.
Yeah.
You know, almost instantly when they sit down, I can pick up their cue. If someone immediately folds a napkin in their lap, I'm probably going to say, hi, welcome, you know, I'm not going to go, hey, what's up? You know, it's a total different atmosphere for a table. And so, like, I understand, like, the question on your finding, like, you asked if, like, a table, the servers, like, joked around with you. That could vary, you know, based on a lot of things, not just,
Right.
like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that, I mean, I don't know how else you would put that in the survey, but that's just something I noticed, like, from what I do, and
sure.
I have been for years, you know?
Yeah.
Can I
Dr.
just?
Edwards, there's some students who need verification.
All right, thank you all.
Do you have a sign-in sheet for them? Or
Yes.
could Dr. Brewster sign?
I just had a question for her. Have you noticed that tips
Yes.
change
Have
based on
some
race?
students to see.
You said they vary based on age, right?